Don't get in the trap of thinking that our problems are only political or economic. We're fighting a spiritual battle. We're fighting the good fight of faith. So how do we win this battle? Well, we've really already won it. We're just demonstrating Satan's defeat. The roadmap to victory is through continuing in the things that we've learned. That's coming up next as Arkansas Live starts right now. I want to reread our text that we've been studying this week. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, the Apostle Paul is talking to his son Timothy, and he says, continue in the things that you've learned. Our title is The Art of Continuing. Continue in the things that you've learned, being assured of, knowing of whom you've learned them. Now, in this instance, Paul was referring Timothy back to his mother and his grandmother. It says in the previous chapter that that's where he learned all this. He said, remember, I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith that's in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice. So he said, I'm stirring you up in remembrance of this. What you learned from your mother and your grandmother, continue in these things that you've learned. Their sound doctrine, being assured of whom you have learned them. Now, we've looked at a lot of different aspects of this, and I'd like to pick up here today by going back to Corinthians that we were finishing up on yesterday, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and let's look at verse 8. This is where the Apostle Paul said, I sought the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me, meaning the attack of the demon spirit, the messenger of Satan. Remember, we're continuing what we've learned. Paul wrote 2/3 of the New Testament. He's exalted because of the revelations. Satan sent a demon spirit to harass him. And Paul besought the Lord, and the Lord said, my grace is sufficient for you. And he didn't say no. You know, I've heard some sermons where they said, Paul asked the Lord 3 times to deliver him, and the Lord said no every time. It doesn't say that here. That's not in the Bible. That's some religious denominational response, but that's not the Scriptures. God said, Paul, my grace is sufficient. More than enough for you to overcome this. My strength, God's strength, is made perfect, complete in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, Paul said, I will rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. He's not glorying for the infirmities. A lot of people get this mixed up. He's not thanking God for the problem. You're not thanking God for your situation if it's ungodly. You're thanking God in the midst of it. He said, most gladly, therefore, will I rejoice, I will glory in my infirmities. Why? That the power of Christ may rest upon me. In other words, I'm looking so forward to the power of Christ working for me. I'm excited about seeing the power of God work in this situation. I am excited. I am rejoicing. I'm glorying in these infirmities that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Go over to James, and he says basically the same thing. In James chapter 1, and he says it a little different way, but he says, brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, knowing this. You can only count it joy if you know this. Knowing this, the trying of our faith worketh patience, but let patience have her perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire, wanting, lacking nothing. If you lack wisdom, ask of God. So Paul's saying basically the same thing here. He said, I am glorying in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, reproaches, necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. Hallelujah. Let the weak say I'm strong. These are spiritual principles. These are things that he learned. He's passing them on to Timothy. Continue in what you've learned. And to do that, you have to refresh yourself in these things. You have to read them, hear them over and over. Reread some of your books. Re-listen to some of your sermons. Go online. I mean, you can watch Arkansas Alive editions coming and going. Just go to On Demand. Go to our website, vtntv.com, and pull up On Demand. You can watch Arkansas Alive episodes. You can watch Sister Jeannie in her program, In His Presence. And I tell you what, she had, oh man, as she was teaching those broadcasts, she had a tremendous amount of revelation knowledge. Her assignment in the church as we pastored was to perfect and prune the women, the ladies. Pruned, polished, and perfected. That was her job, and she did it well. She taught Bible classes. She taught in our college. She taught ladies fall seminars, advances. She really ministered to the women in the church and to get them pruned, polished, and perfected. And you can pull up her sermons, her messages that she teaches on her weekly television program right here on VTN, In His Presence. You can go back and pull up all the lessons that she's taught. Refresh yourself. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. That's why it's good to go back and pull these things up and refresh yourself, because, as the day wears on, as the battle's heated up, you might get weary in well-doing. Don't throw in the towel. Paul said, I take pleasure when these things come, because in distresses for Christ's sake, when I am weak, then am I strong. It doesn't do any good to emphasize the problem. I mean, you can give people information, but if you stay on the problem and you harp on the problem and you preach the problem and teach the problem over and over and over again, you just burden the people down with the problems. I remember the first church I pastored, downtown, inner city, and once, I think it was a Sunday night or a Wednesday night, I was getting ready to go out because I had discovered some sin in the body, and I was going out, and I tell you what, and the Lord kind of got me by the seat of the spiritual britches and said, what are you fixing to do? I said, Lord, I'm going to go out and preach sin to them. He said, no, I don't want you to go preach sin to them. I want you to go teach them about righteousness. I thought, righteousness? And I said this to the Lord. Here's what I said. I said, Lord, if I teach them that they're righteous, they'll forget about their sin. And he didn't answer me. And all of a sudden, it hit. I thought, that's exactly what he wants them to do. He wants them to forget about their sin. He wants them to think about their righteousness. And so many times we preach on the sin and the problems and all that kind of stuff so long, it begins to wear on people. Oh, my Lord, my God, what are we going to do? It's this bad and this. And they begin to get critical, pessimistic. They don't think anybody's telling the truth. They don't think, they think everything is a lie, everything is bad. If you keep hammering away at that, you're going to create a sin consciousness instead of a righteous consciousness. Yes, there are things that are wrong. Yes, there have been people that have lied. But that's not the whole truth. The whole truth is Jesus came and delivered us from the effects of that. And I read the back of the book, we win. We are not in the tribulation now. We are not seeing the pouring out of seals and horses, and that's not happening now. According to my Bible, the church is raptured, caught up before those things start happening. What we're experiencing is the beginning of sorrows. Paul said, perilous times will come, difficult, a reduction of strength, dangerous times. We're in those times now. But the good news is this is just the beginning. While these things must come to pass, we don't have to be affected by them personally. It's like when the pandemic broke out in 2020. I said, Lord, how come we hadn't been able to stop this? We're people of faith. I mean, people fasted, they prayed, they prophesied, they did all these things against the pandemic and had never affected it one bit. I said, what's the problem here? He said, there are certain things that must come to pass. He said, you can't stop that from happening. You can stop it from coming on you and your family, but you can't stop it from coming. And just think about these things. Now you meditate on them. You know, I hear it all the time. Well, the world's headed for hell and it's a downward spiral and all that, and it's your job to stop it. You can't stop it. The world is going to self-destruct. The society, the culture that we know, as we know, is going to self-destruct. You can't stop that. That is set in time. The earth is going to self-destruct. I'm talking about the world, the culture, is going to self-destruct. And it's headed that way now. You can't stop that. What God's called us to do is to preach the gospel to it. That's the main thing. The main thing is to keep the main thing, and not get sidetracked over here in these issues and not go off on a tangent and start beating your drum and all this kind of stuff about everything that's wrong. Everybody knows what's wrong. It's what's right that they're after. How do we live above this? How do we overcome this? As I said in my little booklet, how do we thrive in perilous times? You can go on our website and get your copy of this book. There's principles in here that will help you not just survive, but thrive. Just go to our website, vtntv.com, and you can pull up products and you can order that little booklet. Now, back to what Paul was dealing with here. He said, I take pleasure. He went on to say, I've become a fool in glorying. You have compelled me. I'm not bothered by these things anymore. The Lord has given me understanding and revelation. His grace is more than sufficient for me. Okay, let's go to the next part of 2 Timothy, chapter 3, and let's look at the last part of this passage of Scripture in verse 17, 1 Timothy 3:17, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. Now here's the end result. Here's the purpose of it. The man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. Go to 2 Timothy 2, verses 20 through 26. In a great house, there are not only vessels of gold and of silver, but also of wood and of earth, and some to honor and some to dishonor. If a man therefore purge himself from these, dishonor, he will be sanctified and fit for the master's use and prepared unto every good work. Now notice he didn't say God was going to do this. He said the man has to do this. He has to purge himself from these. He'll be a vessel of honor. That word purge is very interesting. I don't know how many of you know anything about purging. When Jeannie and Ronnie and our son, when we traveled as a family all over this country, north, south, east, and west, in our little van, we went to South Louisiana a lot of times. We ministered in churches all over South Louisiana. And especially during the crawfish season, we would get crawfish to bring back home to Arkansas. One time I remember we were headed north, coming home. We went through Ville Platte, Louisiana. And there used to be a big radio station down there that you could hear all over the country, Ville Platte. And so I saw where they had fresh crawfish for sale. And you could buy it in 50-pound bags. These are live crawfish. And I said, well, how long, will these things last before they start dying? He said, well, where are you headed? I said, I'm going to Little Rock. And he said, oh, they'll last. It was just 2 or 3 hours. So they'll last till you get home. But he said, as soon as you get home, you need to purge them and cook them. I said, okay. We tied that 50-pound bag of crawfish on the bumper of our van. Oh, if we didn't look like the Beverly Hillbillies, we were driving down the road, and we got home about midnight, I guess, and I took those crawfish and I dumped them in a wash tub, and you put what you put in salt water in there, and to purge them. What does purging mean? It means they started spitting up the mud. They're called mud bugs, and they're full of mud because they're raised and live in mud. And they started spitting up, regurgitating the mud that they had digested, and that's called purging. And all that wash tub full of salt water became brown with mud. And then you dump it out, you run fresh water in there, and then you get a big pot and you put it on the stove and you start cooking, and I dumped them all in there and cooked them. Now, this is about midnight. I mean, every cat in the neighborhood was, casing our house. What is this smell we have? But we cooked them all up and put them in the refrigerator to eat the next day. So we purged the crawfish. What do? We get the mud out of them. He said, if you will purge yourself, you put the word in and you get the error out. You put the love in, you get the hate out. You put forgiveness in, you get unforgiveness out. You get the faith and the love of God, and you get criticism out. He said, if you purge yourself from these things, then you'll be a vessel of honor, sanctified and fit for the master's use, and prepared for every good work. Now, let's keep on reading. I want to go to the next verse. Flee also youthful lusts, but follow righteousness, faith, love, charity, peace with them that call on the Lord out of a pure heart. But foolish and unlearned questions avoid, knowing that they do gender strifes. And the servant of the Lord must not strive, but be gentle unto all men, apt to teach, patient. The marginal reference says, forbearing, in meekness instructing those that oppose themselves, if God peradventure will give them repentance to the acknowledging of the truth. Now here's a very important verse. That they may recover themselves. That marginal reference says, awake or arouse themselves. They may recover themselves out of the snare of the devil, who are taken captive by him at his will. Then he goes on and says what we started with, in these last days, perilous times shall come. So the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. Now, before we move on, let me give you a story, an example of, just like I did about the purging, of this verse 26, that they may recover themselves out of the snare of the devil, who are taken captive by him at his will. If Satan can get you all bound up, if he can get you into strife, deception, unforgiveness, criticism, judgmentalism, pride, if he can get you into all those things, he's got you. He doesn't have to come and take his prey right away. He's got you. He can take you any time. That's what's so detrimental about these things. That's where deception is so subtle. You think you're doing fine. You think you're all right. You might be on your soapbox preaching against this and against that and all these things. Then before you know it, all of a sudden, wham, the bottom falls out. What happened? Let me tell you a story. When I was in college, I got a job working one summer at the University of Arkansas Department of Entomology. That's bugs, insects. I was a biology major at that time, and I wanted some practical experience. And there was a man that came to, I was at Henderson State Teachers College, now Henderson State University. And there was a professor that came from the U of A down to Arkadelphia, and he interviewed us. He needed people that would work in his lab. He had a government grant to do research study on spiders, scorpions, etc. Black widows, brown recluse, you name it. So he came looking for workers to work during the summer. And I interviewed for the job. And the way he interviewed you was, you came up to a desk like this. He's sitting here, you're standing there. And he had this cigar box over here. And he would ask you some questions. Now, this was a very eccentric man. And he looked like the mad scientist, so to speak. And he had this cigar box, and he'd say, you have a feel for living things? I said, yes, sir, I do. He said, okay, hold out your hand. You hold out your hand. He opens the cigar box, and he reaches in there and he grabs a brown and golden Mexican tarantula. Yeah, I said it right. And he takes it and he puts it in your hand. Now, this thing's, walking along in your hand like this. And he looks at you to see what you're going to do. Of course, if you scream, throw it, and run out of the room, you're not hired, of course. And I just stood there, and I wasn't afraid, and that tarantula just walked around like this. And he looked at me, and he said, you'll do. And he reached up and picked the tarantula up and put it back in the cigar box. So I was to take care of the spiders that we were raising, because he had done tests. He had provoked a black widow to bite him, and he had an ambulance standing by and a physician, a nurse, to take him to the hospital to give him the antidote. And he recorded the effects of a black widow spider bite while he was in the ambulance going to get the antidote. I told you he was eccentric. He was a weird guy. But he wrote a book on the effects of a black widow spider by personal experience. So I'm in the lab, and we're raising these spiders. And it was my job to feed and water them every day in the lab. And the way he kept these spiders in a petri dish, which is a little glass dish about the size of your hand. And there's a little ball of cotton in there, and every day we'd squirt water in that ball of cotton. And we'd put a fly that we'd trapped and knocked out in the freezer, or a piece of a cockroach that we'd gotten out of the agri barn. That was their food. And then we would watch them, and the fly would come to, having been knocked out by freezing, or the cockroach would move, and that spider would attack them. And they'd stick their little palpi into the cotton and draw the water out, and they'd stick their palpi into the bug and suck the juices out. Now, if you've ever noticed a spider web in your basement, your attic, your house, your garage, whatever, and you in the woods, and you see these spider webs, go outside and look at one on the back porch or front porch, you will see insects that are caught in that web. Now, the way they're caught is they either walk into or fly into that web, and the sticky substance, that web was created out of the spider's abdomen. He makes this out of the stuff, the substance that comes out of his abdomen. It's real sticky. And if you ever run into one in the woods and it gets all over your face, that's designed to catch and trap the animals. And when they get in there, they can't get out. And the spider has created a little burrow, a little hole over to the side where he's watching. He's waiting for the movement. And when the spider sees the movement and he knows he's caught something, he runs out there and wraps it up in this little web and leaves it there. And then he goes back into his hole and waits for another victim. Now, that spider has trapped those insects. They're caught in the web. They can't get out. And they're, jumping around and trying to get out and moving and moving and moving. But the spider doesn't eat them right away. They're already trapped. He's got them in his web. So he waits till he gets hungry. And then if he wants to come out and have a snack, I hope I'm not boring you or making you repulsed, but this is the way it works. He comes out and he sticks those two palpi. And this is what I was studying and watching and helping raise the food and watering and taking care of these spiders for the whole summer. And he comes out and he sticks those two little palpi, like two little pencil points, in these insects and just sucks the juices out. Now, he could have done that any time because they're caught. They're in the web. He can take them any time he wills. Listen to this again. It said that they may recover themselves out of the snare of the devil, who are taken captive by him at his will. This spider has already caught these bugs, these insects, and he can go feed on them and take the life out of them any time that he wills. Why? They're caught in the web. Now, they've done this to themselves. They have gotten stuck in the spider's web, in Satan's web. He doesn't have to come take them right away. If you're walking in unforgiveness and strife and bitterness and hatred and criticism, judgment and pride, all of that stuff is just wrapped in a web. And one day, all of a sudden, for no reason that you can think of, bang, Satan makes his attack and hits you. Just like the spider comes out with those two palpi and puts them in there in the victim and sucks the life out of them. They are taken captive by him at his will. Now, that's my spider story. That's my University of Arkansas summer in the Department of Entomology story. And I wanted to use that to show you Satan's just like that. He creates a web, you get into it, and he comes and destroys you anytime that he wills. Now, join me tomorrow. We're going to get out of the web. Remember, Jesus is Lord of Arkansas, and wherever in the world you're watching, too.
Send your questions, comments, and testimonies to Happy Caldwell at Post Office Box 26207, Little Rock, Arkansas 72221, or email happycaldwell@vtntv.com. Remember to follow VTN on Facebook at VTN Your Arkansas Christian Connection, and follow Happy Caldwell on Twitter at Happy_Caldwell. VTN is on Roku. Search VTN in the channel store and add us to your lineup. Today's episode is available to watch on demand at VTNTV.com and click Watch. You can also watch VTN via live stream at VTNTV.com.